Listen to these words from Luke 12, chapter 13 through 21. Someone in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." But Jesus said to him, "Friend, who set me to be a judge or an arbitrator over you?" And then Jesus said to them, "Take care. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. For one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." And then he told him a parable. He said, "The land of a rich man produced abundantly. And he thought to himself, 'What should I do? For I have no place to store my crops.' And then he said, 'I'll do this. I'll pull down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool. This very night your life is being demanded of you. And the things you have prepared, whose will they be?' And then Jesus said, 'So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich toward God.'" You know, this story has been one that has challenged and haunted me ever since I first read it when I was 17 years old. And I think it grabbed me primarily because, like so many other things in the Bible and teachings of Jesus in particular, it really flew in the face of everything I had been taught as a kid. It was a direct challenge to the conventional wisdom that I had been steeped in my upbringing on the East Coast. In a nutshell, the code that I was raised with was something like this: be a decent human being, but, quote, do well for yourself. You familiar with that phrase? Do well. When it comes to referring to a person's degree of financial success in life, that's what people used to often say. It was kind of the more sophisticated, polite, understated way of saying that a person was rich. You said, well, that person's done very well for himself. The translation, that person's made a lot of money. So when I first heard the story about this farmer, who probably, like any farmer I've ever known, worked hard for what he had. And by the way, it was awesome that Gwen, I think, immediately knew the response that many of us have to saying, well, everything comes from God. She's like, yeah, no, wait a sec, I worked for it. The farmer worked for it, probably, right? Every farmer I know works hard. No such thing as a day off for a farmer. And it's a tough vocation. You can do everything right and still take a beating because of things out of your control, the weather or markets or whatever. And the joke that I think I have told here before, but I'll tell it again just in case. By the way, I'm repeating most of my jokes at this point. I've been here almost 4 years. I got nothing new anymore, so... Anybody new, I'm pretty funny. The rest of you is like, oh, I've heard that before. All right, but there was a farmer who worked really hard, and he had one of those beautiful farms that, everything was just immaculately taken care of, and he grew his farm. He was very successful, and people kept saying to him, oh, you have been blessed by God. You are so blessed by God. And finally, he got kind of tired of feeling like God was getting too much credit. And he said, yeah, you should have seen it when God had it all to himself. Yeah. A lot of people feel that way. In any case, I had a hard time understanding why Jesus and God was so hard on this farmer. He did well for himself. He had a great year. The land produced more than he could even handle, so wisely, responsibly, shrewdly, like a good businessman, he simply increased his capacity to store the grain and said to himself, I've made it. Sure, I got a little bit lucky, but, it all paid off. I've got more than I need. I can relax. I don't have to work anymore. Time to eat, drink, and be merry. Time to play. Kind of like winning the lottery. I mean, I've heard a lot of talk recently. I've been a few conversations with friends as we look at this lottery. So what would you do if you won it? It's an interesting question to ask. So, according to my upbringing, nothing wrong with any of this. But then Jesus throws in this clincher. And he says, but God said to this man, you fool. It's pretty harsh. This very night, your life is being demanded of you. And these things that you prepared, whose will they be? So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves but are not rich toward God. Now, as usual, the teachings of Jesus have so many layers of meaning and will take us as deep as we want to go if we're willing. So let's just take a few quick looks at some things. First of all, from an overall biblical perspective, the problem with this guy's approach to his wealth was that he was completely in it for himself. Or at least there's no reference in the text to anybody else. He thought to himself, what should I do? For I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build larger ones, and I'll put my grain and store my crops. It's just all me, my. There's nobody else there. And more often than not, that's Jesus's and the Bible's problem with material wealth. If there's no one else involved other than us getting ours, then it has this amazing way, subtly and sometimes not so subtly, of bringing our selfishness and our possessiveness to the surface. And it's low-hanging fruit for the ego, let's just put it that way. I want that. It's that little girl in Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. Daddy, I want an Oompa Loompa. I watched that for the first time with my grandchildren, too. I said, I know that girl. In and of itself, there's absolutely nothing wrong with having access to resources and doing well, as long as it was done with integrity. Nothing wrong with enjoying some money and some good things to some degree. But if and when we do, it can't be only and always about us. Because from the perspective of the Bible, everything is a gift from God. There is no such thing as a self-made person. It doesn't exist. Which is not to discount anybody's hard work. But, we say, wait a sec, everything, every breath is a gift from God. And that's stewardship 101. No matter what we have, we didn't make it ourselves. And if we are blessed materially, if we wind up with access one way or another, made it yourself, inherited it, whatever, then according to the Bible, it is a responsibility. It's a calling. It's a blessing, and it's an opportunity to be a blessing. It's not that God doesn't want us to enjoy stuff. It's that God really wants us to be full of joy. And the simple truth is that joy comes more from sharing and offering and giving than from entitlement and getting and keeping. As a dear friend of mine named Frank Butler, Harriet Taylor, who's with us on Zoom from Washington, Harriet and I used to work closely with Frank. He was a CEO of Eastman Gel, a fully owned subsidiary of Kodak. And he used to do workshops on money and resources. And he used this phrase, which I've never forgot. He said, we are God's distribution system. And that always reminded me of a Haitian proverb that I heard first from a very, very poor man in Haiti who, describing his life to a group I was leading one day, he said, I get up in the morning and I go down to the market And I pray for the grace not to be a thief because I'm hungry. So I go so I can smell the food. And somebody in our group, we were all, I mean, you could have heard a pin drop. We were blown away by this guy saying this. When we said, tell us about your life, we weren't expecting him to go there. And somebody said, well, but here you are. Thank God, God provides. You know, it's all, an aside, it's a better policy not to say anything when you don't know what to say, usually. But he looked at this woman and at all of us and he said, yeah, you know, in Haiti we have a proverb. God provides, but God does not divide. There's enough. It's just not getting where it needs to go more times than not. That's up to us. You know, my music ministry over the years, before becoming a pastor, for those of you who don't know me, for 30 years I was a freelance musical minister. I write songs, did concerts, led retreats, did a lot of work with junior and senior high youth. And in my work with junior and senior high youth, I would often use a little game or an exercise of sorts called the Here I Stand game. Maybe some of you have done this before at some corporate in-service meeting or something like that. But it's a great way to get at values, and you'll see, well, I'll explain it to you. And we get everybody in a big group, and then I, or whoever's in charge, reads a definitive statement that's usually obnoxiously black and white. And then if you agree with that statement, 100% you go, say that would be the agreement wall, you'd go stand next to the agreement wall. And if you totally agreed with it, you'd be up against the wall. If you totally disagreed with it, you'd go to the other side and stand on the other wall. And if you weren't sure, you know, or you kind of agreed, but it depended on some things, well, then you'd be kind of in the middle over here. If you didn't want anybody to know where you stood, or you just didn't know what you thought, then you'd be right in the middle, because it always, you know, you should never put anybody on the spot. It was always amazing. We would start with something really innocuous. Like I would say, vanilla is better than chocolate. And they'd laugh and, you know, they'd be over here and everything. And okay, then the Packers are better than the Bears. That would usually get some energy going. But then we'd work our way a little bit deeper. And I'd start asking harder questions. And by the way, it's a great way when there's a controversial issue in a community to get the community talking about it, because the ground rules were that eventually I would say, if you would like to share with us, if anybody's willing to share why you're standing where you're standing, we'd love to hear from you. But the ground rule is nobody else gets to speak back to you. It's like the talking feather. We just hear each other. And it's not going to go point, counterpoint, or there's no debate. We want to create an atmosphere where it feels safe enough to risk saying what you really think and respecting each other. And we always would get into some fascinating conversations. Then eventually I would add, hey, if your faith in God, if you have one, has anything to do with why you're standing where you're standing, feel free to include that too. Always amazing. Almost always, at some point, once we were into it pretty deeply, I would say this. Here's the statement. It's possible to be a multimillionaire and keep all the money for yourself and still be a faithful Christian. Now, before I say anything more, where would you be? We would always have people at both extremes. And the ones who said, well, I totally disagree with that statement, you know, they'd say all the good things like, well, you know, you got to share and you know, things along the lines of what I was just saying. But usually some honest person of integrity at the other end would say something like, well, I don't think God cares about your money. God cares about your heart. And plus, you know, you worked hard for that money. You should be able to do what you want with it. I don't think that has anything to do with faith. And we would never argue about it. And the last thing I would do if somebody said that was to clobber them with a Bible verse. It was more sacred that they felt safe to say what they really thought about a deep subject. And it always is. Well, the problem was that what was missing from that kind of response was the needs and the circumstances and the realities of other people, or the dream of God for a world of justice and compassion and enough for all. You do know that is God's intention for the world, that everybody would have enough. There is no good reason in this world for perennial, grinding, generational poverty. In fact, Old Testament theologian Walter Brueggemann often said that the Jubilee, whereby all debts, every 50 years, all debts would be released, were God's way of trying to institute that there'd never be a permanent underclass. He also would be quick to point out that even the people of Israel did not live that out, maybe once. All right. So what else is this text saying? I won't take much time to get into other things, but just a few things that jump out. You know, it doesn't say that the guy was a farmer. I don't know if you caught that or not. For years, I thought it said he was a farmer, that he grew the food. It just says it was a rich man who owned land. He could have been an absentee landlord, which was very common in those days, exploiting sharecroppers and exacting a portion of what they grew, and if they could not pay it, they would sell themselves into slavery. That's how many people became slaves. So maybe this was a teaching about absentee landlords. It says that he already was rich. I won't go anywhere else with that, but there's also the interesting thing Jesus says before he tells the story. He says, beware of all forms of greed. Be on your guard against every form of greed. You know, there's a lot of kinds of greed. There's a lot of different currencies other than money. According to the Bible, greed monetarily is referred to in 1 Timothy as the love or the lust for money, which is a root of all evil. It's a terribly dangerous and deceptive and destructive thing. In the Ten Commandments, the word covetousness is used. What is that? Well, it's not just about money. Let's just get away from money for a minute. It's to want something or maybe someone. I mean, in a lot of texts, it's stated, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. That's the commandment. It's to want something so bad that you won't stop at anything to get it, that you can't stop thinking about it. You're obsessed with it. You got to have it. You'd take it if you could. Would set aside your deepest core values in order to get this thing, this opportunity, this promotion, this house, this vacation, this new job, this car, this or that elective cosmetic surgery. It'd be all kinds of things. Jesus called it mammon. He says you can't serve God and mammon. Sometimes that's translated money. The best translation is the spirit of gain, moreness. It's spiritual poison. It's usually stuff that enough money can make happen. It's the disease of using money and affluence and the control and the influence that comes along with it to get what you want. It's Citizens United. It's every darn politician in some rich person's pocket. It's what Tony Campolo called affluenza. And the Greek word used in this text, translated greed, is pleonexia. The literal translation of pleonexia is an insatiable desire for more of that which one already has. It gets into the area of obsession and addiction. And pleonexia can get you with almost anything. So a good question for us to ask ourselves is, so what do you have that you can't get enough of? And Jesus is saying, pay attention to that. Be careful. This is nuclear grade stuff here. All right, well, one last question. It's a really heavy question, but a beautiful question. If you knew you were going to die tonight, what would God say to you about your life? You know, every religious tradition I know of, every spiritual tradition somehow confronts us with that. Whether it's traditions from the East, Buddhism, Taoism, they all say, die before you die. Ask yourself, what's your life about? And if it ended today, because tomorrow isn't guaranteed to anybody. I hope we all live a long time. Some of us are getting closer to the end, let's face it. For most of us in this room, there's more behind us than in front of us, right? But he's saying, so what's life about? And, you know, there's the old adage that, you know, being rich toward God is making sure that the ladder you are climbing in your life is leaning on the right wall. You don't want to get to the top or to the end and realize, oh man, what have I done with my life? And so it's a beautiful invitation, wherever you are, to just stop and say, am I focused on what matters, really? And not to scare ourselves into making a change, but in order to be in alignment with where the deepest and greatest joy is, because that's all Jesus and God wants, for us to be free and to spend these beautiful, precious few years we have connected to what really matters. And what is that? Well, you all know. Talk about it all the time in here. That's why we exist. Love, compassion, justice. Let's be a place where Mark can begin worship by saying, hey, I know of this family that needs a place to live. Yeah, that's who we are. To try to somehow spend our lives being more a part of love's response to the realities of the world than the problem. That's all I'm asking for. When I die someday and stand before God, I want to at least hope that God catches me in the process of trying to flow with the current of the river of the universe instead of swimming against it. So I'm going to close two quick stories of two people at the end of their life. One was my stepfather. I was privileged to have this awesome stepfather for about 30 years. As I mentioned before, he was an evangelical atheist, which meant it wasn't okay. You know, he wasn't satisfied to just not believe himself. He wanted to convince everybody else, and initially, especially me. And he and my mom found each other just as I had my spiritual awakening at age 16, 17. And she figured she would sick him on. He was a trial attorney. And she would sick him on me to, you know, disavow me of this religious nonsense. And it began a 30-year relationship where we loved each other. And when he realized that, you know, I was doing my homework and I had some pretty good responses to most of his, to be honest, rather sophomoric questions. And he got to the end of his life, had congestive heart failure. And I went down to see him and my mom. My mom was in the hospital. She wasn't doing well either. And he said to me something along these lines. He said, you know, I know it's getting real close to the end. I wasted my life. I said, what do you mean? He said, my entire life has been about nothing but what's good for me. That's guided my relationships, that's guided my choices, that's guided my politics, that's guided what I do with my money. It's all been about what's in it for me. And you know what? I don't feel real good about that. And we had a beautiful conversation. And I said, you know, I think you're in for a great surprise. I think, you know, when the end does come, you're going to be surprised that you are welcomed home to the arms of love that has cherished you all along. And he said, you know, I'd like to believe that, but I don't. And I've spent my whole life putting that down. And I've got too much pride or integrity, you call it whatever you want, to have a foxhole conversion now. But he said this, he said, you know, I wish I could believe that. And then 15 minutes later, I found him passed in his bedroom. I'm smiling because there was more. We actually made a deal that he would let me know if I was right, but doesn't work that way. The other person, though, is Martin Luther King Jr. And I end with this. Very close to the end of his life, and he knew his days were numbered. In one of his speeches, he said, if any of you are around when I have to meet my day, I don't want a long funeral. And if you get somebody to deliver the eulogy, tell them not to talk too long. Tell them not to mention that I have a Nobel Peace Prize, because that's not important. Tell them not to mention that I have 300 or 400 other awards, because those aren't important either. Tell them not to mention where I went to school. Don't talk about things like that. Instead, I'd like somebody to mention on that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to love somebody, and that he tried to help somebody, and that he tried to give his life serving others. Rich toward God. Not perfect. But as far as we're concerned, that's a pretty good definition of what it means to do well from the God of the Bible's perspective. As Jesus said, the greatest among you will be the servant of all. So let's enjoy life while we have it. Let's not worry too much about making it great, because our egos would love to mess us up even trying to be great in God's eyes. But let's just do our best to make our lives, whatever time, energy, and resources we have, count for the things that matter. And let's do well not just by ourselves and for ourselves, but together for what's best for everyone. Amen.